Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I am your host, Cameron Bertuzzi. Today what we're doing is we're responding to a video by skydivephil. He recently put out a video featuring responses to the fine-tuning argument from physicists and philosophers. And so what we're doing today is I've invited a philosopher and a physicist myself to kind of look at some of the things that were said in that video, and we're going to respond to it. So this is ultimately going to be a defense of the fine-tuning argument. I did want to say at the beginning of this video that if you are just now joining us, if you are a new subscriber as a result of the news that was just announced last week of my upcoming conversion to Catholicism, welcome, first of all, to the channel. But I did want to let you know we are sticking to our guns here. We will be covering topics that are sort of broadly relevant to mere Christianity. So that's one of the reasons why we're focusing on this type of content moving forward. Let's just get into it. Let's welcome our guest. We've got Dr. Luke Barnes with us back on the channel. He's been on the channel several times. And then Philip Goff. He's a philosopher, not a Christian, not a theist, but he is nevertheless very interested in fine-tuning arguments. He's published on them, and he has some things to say in response to the video that we're reviewing today. But both of these guys, as I mentioned, have been on the channel before. They're both awesome in their own ways, but I love both of them. So Luke and Philip, welcome back to the show.
Thanks.
Hello. Thanks for having us on. I've just noticed, Cameron, tweeting about this. You've just overtaken me in terms of Twitter followers, which I'm not very happy about.
Really?
Must be the upcoming commercial. Never mind. I'll try not to be angry about that.
Sorry, guys. I'm just trying to get my my screen here. Okay, now I can see everyone directly in front of me. So what we're going to do today, in response to this video from skydivephil, we've got 10 clips queued up. And so what we're going to do is we're going to play one of the clips, and then we're going to get thoughts from Luke and Philip in response to the clip that's been played there. And what we've tried to do is play clips that are sort of representative of most of the ideas that you see in the video. And again, this is like a sort of a sampling. So if you'd like to watch the whole video, I've got it linked in the description of this video. If you'd like to see all of the clips and their full context and everything, make sure to go check out the whole video if you'd like that. But in this video, we're just looking at some, as I said, some representative clips, and then we'll provide some responses to that. So without further ado, I think we're ready to go. Are you guys ready to look at the first clip? Okay. Great. So the first clip that we've got queued up here is just the very, very beginning of the video, kind of, which basically explains what they're doing. It kind of gives an overview of the fine-tuning argument. I've included that section as well because it's just kind of helpful to, if you guys are new maybe to the fine-tuning argument, it's just going to kind of lay it out. But then they also explain who they've chosen to interview for their video, and that's what's kind of relevant to this clip. So let's go ahead and play this one, and then we'll get some responses.
Our universe is filled with galaxies, nebula, stars, and planets, and perhaps most importantly, living things. But it's been argued that if the constants of nature were even slightly different, then none of this would be possible. And that this fine-tuning is evidence of a God that had to select the constants to be just right. The argument is often expressed like this: the fine-tuning is vastly improbable under naturalism, but not theism, and thus supports the existence of God. In this film, we'll hear from some of the world's leading physicists and philosophers of physics who'll explain why they disagree. We've had the good fortune to interview many of the world's leading cosmologists, and what's clear is there is far less consensus that fine-tuning is real than advocates of the argument let on.
So Luke, this clip was one of the clips that you wanted to include for today. I'll let you start with it, and then Philip, if you have any thoughts, we'll get yours after Luke.
So let me say a couple of things in a row. First of all, this video, I have complete respect for someone who thinks, you know, they're fascinated by all these ideas about modern cosmology and wants to go and talk to actual cosmologists, which is what skydivephil has done in his video. So I have complete respect for that. I should say, just looking ahead at the video before we get into criticisms, I agree with some of what's said in the video. There's various bits throughout where actually I was finding myself in agreement. But there's a couple of worries I have already. One of them is that they've not used any defender of fine-tuning's actual formulation of the fine-tuning argument. No one formulates it exactly that way. It's close, but the second premise is problematic for a start. That leads to a sort of bigger worry about this video. It gives the impression, without saying it, that throughout the video, the supporters of fine-tuning who will be quoted are people like Justin Brierley, William Lane Craig, John Lennox, Frank Turek, and Jeff Zweerink. That's all of them. Justin Brierley's a radio presenter, smart guy, but a radio presenter. Jeff Turek is a popular level apologist. Jeff Zweerink is an astrophysicist, but he gets one sentence. John Lennox is a mathematician. He gets one sentence. And then William Lane Craig gets less words in the entire hour than a doctoral candidate called Stav Zalel. And against that, we have about 15 professional cosmologists and philosophers speaking at length. And so what the video is doing is putting popular level apologists and a little bit of William Lane Craig up against, for the most part, up against the sort of professional philosophy and physicists. But amongst those professional philosophers and physicists, there's a very carefully selected group there who say the sort of replies against the fine-tuning argument that Skydive Phil wants to say. So, for example, I could go out and make a documentary like this if I had the time. I could go and interview Martin Rees, Paul Davis, Bernard Carr, George Ellis, Aaron Wall, Geraint Lewis, Stephen Barr, Don Page, Max Tegmark, Avi Loeb, Mario Livio. There was a book recently, a contributed volume called Fine-Tuning in the Physical Universe. I could interview all of the contributors to that book, Cambridge University Press. I could go and get philosophers, Robin Collins, Richard Swinburne, John Hawthorne, Yoav Isaacs, Jason Waller, Mike Roeder, John Leslie, Andrew Loki, Simon Frederick. I could make a documentary like this, which would be entirely the other half of the story, and it would all sound really great and supportive of fine-tuning, and people would complain that I'd only presented half the story. And so I want to be clear that that's what this video is going to do. When they say we've interviewed some of the world's leading philosophers and physicists, they really mean some. They mean a carefully collected set who will say the right critical things against fine-tuning, and almost very, very few people who will say anything to actually, at least even just to present the argument in their own words. No supporter of fine-tuning is allowed to do that. Now, it's fine to be one-sided, right? That's okay. You just have to tell us. You just have to put that on the label. So people complain about one of Lee Strobel's books, that it was very one-sided. But the name of the book is The Case for Christ. So you can't really complain when it's right there in the title. So the worry I have is that it gives the impression that fine-tuning has religious apologists on one side and all the philosophers and physicists and people who know what they're talking about on the other side. And that's not correct.
Philip, do you have any thoughts or pushback or anything?
Yeah, no, similar thoughts. I both loved and hated this video. I think I have to say I loved it because I thought a lot of the content was really good. I thought they're pressing in the right places. They are raising very serious challenges, and they got on very good people. I mean, I think I remember, Cameron, you had on Luke to discuss a really bad fine-tuning video a while back, which sort of got everything wrong. But this, most of the points raised, I have to say, maybe Luke will disagree a bit, I think most of the points raised were really important challenges. But what I hated about it is I think it's intellectually dishonest to present a sort of debunking style presentation about a matter for which the relevant experts are not in agreement. This is not something like, climate change, where you can say, 90+% of the relevant experts, climate scientists, think one thing here. This is a matter at which both physicists and philosophers disagree. And you have to make that clear, whereas the whole spirit of it is this, debunking feel like you're just getting the experts in to show why this view is foolish. And I just think that is a bit unethical. I mean, I don't think anyone should be locked up or anything, but there's something a bit intellectually dishonest about that. So, a great video in terms of the content, but the approach, I really think is problematic.
So, Luke, do you have any issues with us calling this defending the fine-tuning argument and then kind of being one-sided about that? I don't think you would, because it's in the title, right?
Yeah, you can be one-sided. Well, it's the impression that it gives that I'm really quite worried about. That it's religious apologists and amateurs and that versus, here's what all the real people who really know what's going on think about this.
Yeah, it's like if I've heard Luke do fine-tuning interviews, and he will often point out matters where there's controversy. He'll defend his side, but be honest about this debate here. When I'm teaching my students philosophy of mind today, and I point out to them where there's disagreements. This is what I think, but there's areas of disagreement. As Luke already referred to John Hawthorne, one of the most respected and influential philosophers, who's not like, I don't know if he's a theist or he's not known as someone who's a religious defender of theism or a Christian or something, but has defended this argument in a very sophisticated and way in which academic philosophers respect. It's just giving a very false impression.
All right, let's move on to clip number 2, which is about life in other universes. So what we're doing is we're playing clips from this video, responding to them, and we've got about 10 queued up. This is number 2.
And people say, yes, but if the constants were a little bit different, there would be nothing. And that's incredible intellectual arrogance and stupidity, because nobody would be able today, from the standard model, to predict chemistry and life. Nobody at all. So how do you know what would happen if you change a value of a constant? Imagine you change the mass of a quark, a coupling of the Higgs a little bit. Of course there would not be carbon, there would not be stars, but there would be something else. And nobody's able to say correctly and plausibly and credibly that the universe would not be complex and whatever, because we're not able to do this calculation.
So, Luke, we'll turn it over to you. I mean, I imagine you're going to have some disagreement about this one.
Yeah, look, I mean, there is a broad scientific literature in the professional, physics journals, which claims to do exactly what Ravelli says is impossible, which claims to predict exactly what would happen if these constants had been different. There's all sorts of papers out there doing the hard work of doing the calculations of what would happen if you change these constants. And he's giving the impression here that, no one really knows because no one's bothered to do the calculation. Now, there's a logical problem here that's really quite important. So Sean Carroll says a similar thing, we can't take the standard model of particle physics as we have it and predict that, say, the structure of water, for example, or so anything. We can't predict that much about chemistry just based on the fundamental the standard model of particle physics. That's not the kind of argument that fine-tuning needs. This is a really important logical point. Yes, we can't start from, if you just gave me the standard model of particle physics, or gave any physicist, and they gave them the standard model of particle physics and the values of all the constants that go in that equation, they would not be able to say, definitely if that equation holds, there will be life in that universe. They wouldn't be able to rule it out, but they wouldn't be able to definitely prove that because the maths is just a bit too difficult. But that's not what fine-tuning is trying to do, and it's not what fine-tuning needs. The arguments that are there in the literature, which you'd think someone who is familiar with the literature might actually try and deal with, rather than just slagging them off as being impossible and arrogant, are things like, if the constants were such and such, then the most stable, lightest particle you could make out of just quarks, in our universe it's the proton, which you may be familiar with. In these other universes it would be a different kind of particle. For various reasons having to do with energy levels, that particle wouldn't be able to bind to itself or to anything else. And so the smallest piece of stuff in the universe, the only stable thing in the universe, is unable to create any structure at all, and therefore we don't think it could make life. That's the kind of argument that's out there. There's no, you have to, predict your way all the way up. So the fact that we can't do that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter. It's not what we have to do to make a fine-tuning argument. As I look at the sort of possibilities of what these constants could have been, I don't have to identify where life definitely will be to make a fine-tuning argument. I do the easier job, which is the opposite of that, which is finding places where life almost certainly isn't. Now, almost certainly is enough here. I mean, proofs are very difficult to do, but that's the sort of argument that's there throughout the literature. And here's the thing. What Ravelli says is impossible, Sean Carroll does later in the video. Ravelli says we can't take the constants and laws of nature and say that definitely there wouldn't be life in a given universe with a given set of constants. At 2257, go look it up, Sean Carroll says, quote, if the cosmological constant were very large or very large and negative, then there's just not enough time and not enough, I said something else there, but not enough time to make a planet, much less a living being. That's very, very plausible. It's exactly what Ravelli just said was impossible. It's literally 20 minutes later in the video. So this is just Ravelli ignoring most of the literature. Like, at least present what's been argued for in the literature and then argue against it, rather than just assuming or giving the impression that these tens, maybe over 50 papers don't exist.
Luke, what's like a really good example of that, where if you were to alter one of these constants or quantities, then it'd be very obvious that life wouldn't be possible? I mean, the first one that kind of comes to mind to me, well, between the gravitational constant and the cosmological constant, like those I think are kind of easy to see what would happen if you start to alter them. For like gravity, if you alter the strength of gravity, everything is going to collapse back in on itself. How are you going to get life in a universe like that? But then if you make it too weak, then everything just kind of floats away from each other. So particles are. Anyways, I wanted to hand it over to you and kind of let you just spell out, give us a really clear example of fine tuning where if you alter one of these things, and it's like you said, very implausible that you're actually going to get life forms or life or anything like that.
So I actually like the example that I've sort of hinting to before. So there's a paper by Stephen Barr and Almas Khan called Anthropic Tuning of the Weak Scale and of the two Higlet dust. Anyway, people can go find that lovely, fascinating published work. If you change the masses of the fundamental bits we're made out of electrons and up quarks and down quarks. That's the names of the stuff. There's your Lego pieces to make, all of this stuff, right? It's impressive, right? 3 pieces. What happens if you change just the masses of each of those particles? And this paper does the work of doing the calculations of trying to work out what would happen. They present a sort of 2-dimensional plot where you can try and work out what happens over here, what happens over there. Actually, in our book, Geraint Lewis and I made a three-dimensional version of this to try and really map it all out to see what would happen. One of the examples is the one I just mentioned. For a certain part of that space of masses, the lightest thing you can make out of the quarks, and therefore the most stable thing you can make out of the quarks, is not the proton, which we're all made out of, right? But it's something called the delta plus plus particle, or in another bit of space, it would be the delta minus particle. And then they do the calculation of, okay, in our universe, we have nuclear binding, proton, neutron, they stick together. You can make, from that, you can make, nuclei of atoms, throw an electron around the outside, you've got atoms. Hey presto, you're on your way to making chemistry. The delta plus plus particle and the delta minus particle will not bind for fairly general energetic reasons. But there's no stable state there. And so the prediction would be, if you had a universe in which the most fundamental thing was those particles rather than the proton, you would not have the periodic table at all. You would say, for the delta plus 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 particle, the best you would have is one type of atom which has the chemistry of helium. If you know your chemistry, helium has no chemistry, no chemical reactions, no chemical bonds, nothing. It won't bond. And so you've got, that's an interesting case. It's purely fantasy to look at that calculation in the literature and then to go, oh, but something might happen somewhere, when literally the fundamental bits of the universe that everything's made out of literally won't stick to each other. Like, what sort of life form are you imagining? If you think there's a life form that could exist in that universe, it better be something really simple, because you've only got simple stuff to make it out of, in which case you should be able to tell us what that life form's going to be. So that's an example.
Philip, what are your thoughts? Yeah, it looks like you wanted to say something.
Just a couple of quick things. One thing, Luke points out that Sean Carroll, although he says Ravelli type things about a lot of the fine-tuning, he does think with the cosmological constant that's fine-tuned for life. Someone else who thinks that is Alan Guth, a key multiverse theorist. Now, this isn't one of the clips we've queued up, but they have Guth on, and they have him saying the Ravelli type things about lots of fine-tuning, but they cut him off before he says, he does think the cosmological constant is fine-tuned. I know that because they've taken it from another skydivephil movie about the multiverse that I happen to have seen. So that's just another case in which they've, it's a little bit of a uncomfortable presentation here. In fact, if you stitch together different opinions here, you could make a fine-tuning argument. Because there's people like Guth who certainly do believe in fine-tuning and use it to argue for a multiverse. There's other scientists in the film who are skeptical about the multiverse. If you glued those opinions together, you'd arguably have, a fine-tuning argument for design, right? If you have the people who think there's fine-tuning and the people who are skeptical of a multiverse. So, it's all a bit... Just a final thing I wanted to say, which just fits in with some of the things Luke's been saying. One thing I often find in critiques of fine-tuning arguments is that they just ramp up the standards of proof in a really artificial way that you don't find in other contexts. And this fits, I think, with what Luke's saying, like that, there could be some life maybe in this universe, even though no two particles will ever meet. Who knows? I think that's the kind of, the demand for proof. And Sean Carroll saying, well, we don't have a definition of life. I mean, like, you're ever going to be able to give a totally precise definition. You can make some plausible informed guess about whether you could have life in a universe where there's just hydrogen. And so I think that's something to watch out for. That's going to come up again, I think, that kind of ramping up the standards too high.
Can I jump in? Fine-tuning doesn't need a definition of life. Because all we need, here's the parameter, here's all the possibilities, right? Have this constant and that constant, right? What I need for a fine-tuning argument is to say that this bit over here, that's definitely not alive. This might sound like a finicky point. All I need to do is to identify in particular cases that what happens there is not alive. So as Phil just said, in a universe where particles ever touch each other, nothing there should possibly fulfill any definition of alive. That's all we need. I don't need a general, I don't need to answer, are viruses really alive? Is this computer alive? I don't need that. All the debates about life, we don't care. They don't affect fine tuning. All I need is to identify scenarios where definitely, if I can say this glass is not alive, that's it. That'll do. That's all fine tuning needs.
Okay, let's move on because we're only through clip 2 and we've been going, let's see how long, for 27 minutes. So we'll try to go a little bit quicker with these next ones. All right, so the next 3 clips are all about probability and more on the philosophy side of things. So I think Philip is going to be speaking more to these. Well, Luke, I know you got things to say as well. So again, we'll try to move quicker through these. Let's get to clip 3.
When people bring up the notion of fine tuning, what they have in mind is they look at the world around them and they say, the universe around them, and they say, gee, it seems so unlikely. So the question is, what is that notion of unlikely that they're employing?
There's a few different ways you could try to say, that's what we mean when we say something's probable.
Most people nowadays will think that there are at least 2 different notions of probability. They're often called objective and subjective, but the objective one is something to do with what happens in the real world, and the subjective one is one to do with degrees of belief.
So I might believe different things to various degrees. I might be more confident that it will be sunny tomorrow in Los Angeles than that the Los Angeles Dodgers will win their baseball game.
The most common understanding of an objective probability is a frequentialist one.
We know, for example, that with human births, more boys are born than girls. So even though there are 2 possibilities and you might naturally think it's going to be 50-50, actually there's slightly more boys born than girls.
The other takes on probability, one was Karl Popper. He said a probability is actually a propensity in a thing. So a thing has this feature that it has certain tendencies. So you see there's sort of problems for all of these accounts of probability for pulling off a fine-tuning argument. Frequency, we don't get an infinite number of universes over and over again. At least most people don't think that. It's just one. We have one universe. So how could it be something that's probable or improbable according to long-term frequency? For subjective Bayesians, who cares what the probability is, because it's not something in the world and it can't convince people. Because if they think this universe is likely, well, that's their opinion. And then propensity also runs into this problem that before the universe exists, it can't have a propensity to be one thing or another. So it does actually look like fine-tuning has slightly shady chances on any of the standard accounts of probability.
Okay, yeah, go ahead and start, and then we'll.
Yeah. So firstly, I think, again, this is really the place to push at fine-tuning arguments. There are important challenges to try and press that there is no relevant and coherent notion of probability that can be made use of here, and there are very important challenges, and all the people are great and they're making good points, but there is something a bit dodgy about what we've just seen. Let's think carefully about the kinds of probability that are presented to us and the kinds of probability that are rejected. So first we get this distinction between objective and epistemic probability. Then we get a distinction between 2 kinds of objective probability, frequentialism or the propensity view. Right. Okay. So they're the kinds of probability that are presented to us. Now, what kinds of probability do we get rejected? We get the 2 kinds of objective probability we've had rejected, the propensity view and the frequentialist view. And I think the reasons there are pretty good, that the fine-tuning theorist can't really make use of them. But do we get it? So we get objective probability ruled out, but do we get epistemic probability ruled out? Not quite. What we get is a rejection of subjective Bayesianism, roughly the view that you can put in to your Bayesian calculations whatever priors you want. Right, but that's just one conception of epistemic probability. There's another conception of probability here, namely objective Bayesianism, according to which there is a fact of the matter about which probabilities we ought to plug in. And that is almost certainly the kind of probability that you're going to run a fine-tuning argument on. I think it's the kind of probability Luke or Robin Collins or whoever is going to run on. So Now, the arguments aren't all settled here. We've still got questions about how we make sense of these objective epistemic probabilities. That's going to be the next clip. But still, it's presented here like, oh, look, we've gone through all the forms of probability. We've shown how none of them work. Whereas there's a sort of sleight of hand. We haven't actually considered the one kind of probability that almost all fine-tuning theorists appeal to, namely objective epistemic probabilities. So that's my worry with that.
Luke, you were nodding a lot. What are your thoughts?
Well, that is literally exactly what I was going to say. the type of probability that almost everyone who tries to do fine-tuning arguments relies on, it was not even mentioned in this video. It's bizarre. It's just so no one tries to run a fine-tuning argument based on frequentism. No one. As far as I know, doesn't exist, not out there. So who? Yeah. I had to think myself. I think I got it. No one's doing that, and so to reject that is just nothing. Who cares, right? Why don't you actually say something about objective Bayesianism? And here's the thing: if you'd asked, say, Barry Lower, I've had some interesting chats with Barry about it. He'll say some really interesting stuff, but none of that's in the video.
Maybe we should, the next clip, we'll get more into this, I think.
Yeah, and that way we can actually kind of keep trucking through this as quickly as possible. Okay, here's clip number 4.
In order to avoid these problems, fine-tuning advocates often appeal to something called the principle of indifference.
The principle of indifference says, in some sense, that if we're indifferent between two hypotheses, then we should assign the same probability to both of them. But there's many cases in which that's going to give us inconsistent results for the probability assignments that we make.
So, for example, 7 days in the week. You don't know what day it is. It could either be Monday or not Monday, and you've got no way of choosing between those two things. So the probability that it's Monday has probability half. So the probability of Tuesday is a half, the probability of Wednesday is a half, and so on. So applying the principle of indifference, you just get inconsistent results.
Yeah, so can I come in? So again, this is the right place to push. I think the fine-tuning theorist is going to have to appeal to the principle of indifference, and there is a healthy debate about this. And all these guys are making good arguments, I think. However, what argument have we been given here against the principle of indifference? What Graham Priest was giving us there was argument that there are cases in which the principle of indifference is inapplicable because it leads to contradictory results. Okay, grant that. At best, that shows there are some cases in which the principle of indifference is inapplicable. It doesn't follow from that, at least without further argument, that the principle of indifference is never applicable. And indeed, for what it's worth, Al Hayek, one of the world's most influential probability philosophers of probability, in the he wrote the entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia on interpretations of probability, and in his discussion of these problems for the indifference principle, he summarizes by concluding, to be sure, problems caution us that there are limits to the principle of indifference, but arguably we must just be careful not to overstate its applicability, right? Therefore, it's not always applicable, but that doesn't mean it's not sometimes applicable. And it seems to me that there obviously are cases in which it is applicable. I mean, the case Al Hayek gives is, you're on a game show, the prize is behind one of 3 doors, and you're trying to think, I wonder, is it behind door B? What's the probability? 1 in 3, right? Because you use the principle of indifference. You don't know, there's a fact of the matter about which it's behind. You don't know which. You divide your probability. You divide your credence evenly. So just because it's not applicable in all cases doesn't mean it's not applicable in any cases. And I think this is particularly important because Robin Collins, who's a prominent defender of the fine-tuning argument and someone whose work they're considering in this video, does not appeal to a general unrestricted principle of indifference. He precisely refers to what he calls a restricted principle of indifference. He restricts it to when we're dealing with natural variables, which he defines as variables which occur in the simplest formulation of the relevant area of physics. Now, maybe that's a good way of running it. Maybe it's an objectionable way of running it. But again, there's something a bit, shall we say, problematic that they don't even consider Robin Collins's way of running the principle of indifference, right? They just suggest the fine-tuning theorist is going to be using this very general principle of indifference, and they raise problems for a very unrestricted principle of indifference. And just finally, again, it's just generally you're look, there's a healthy debate here, but you're getting the sense as the viewer, especially, people won't know, a lot of people watching this won't know anything about these debates. You get the sense that, it's this old-fashioned notion that nobody believes in anymore. It's been refuted. No, there's a healthy debate about the principle of indifference. And so you should be honest. Mm-hmm. And look, as you know, I'm not a Christian. I'm not a theist, at least not in the traditional sense. I hate this when religious people do it. I hate it when atheists do it. Just where there is no consensus, be honest, and be honest with your viewer and present that there is a debate and a dispute here.
We do have, on that note, we had a super chat sent in by Maverick Christian. He says, the principle of indifference doesn't lead to inconsistent results, and then he cites a paper by Wolfgang Terschik. How do you say his name? Where the quote is, or the title of the paper is just, "The principle of indifference does not lead to contradictions." So, as you say, there is a literature here. Luke, any thoughts on this clip?
No, nothing beyond that. I mean, the example that Priest gives is obviously you can't use it in that scenario. Again, I'm a Bayesian. Edwin James, in his book Probability Theory, has a good discussion of when exactly you apply a principle of indifference. It wouldn't apply to Priest cases. I think it's fine to apply to fine tuning because we're trying to model the way in which one idea supports another idea. As was said, there's a healthy debate here, but this isn't it.
Okay, let's move on to clip number 5, where we deal with infinities and probability. So here we go.
If you assign them all equal probability, if you give them any finite probability, they've got to add up to 1, and that can't. If you take any infinite number of finite quantities, they add up to something that's infinite. If you want to normalize and make sure you get a value that's between 0 and 1, you've got to say that each thing has 0 probability, but then we hit the problem of dividing by 0. But on the other hand, if you give them a probability greater than 0, then they're going to add up to something infinite. So, I mean, either it's 0 or it's infinite, and neither of those is going to work.
Luke, I remember you and I talking about, Philip, I know you're about to come in. I'm about to pass it over to you, but I just remember sort of nostalgically Luke and I talking about the normalization problem years ago, and then he wrote his paper on it, and I'm sure he'll have some thoughts on it. But I was just thinking about that. Philip, what are your thoughts on this clip?
Yeah, thanks. So this is the last clip I wanted to have queued up. So again, I've said it twice now. I'll say it again. This is an important challenge, and it's right that they're pressing it. So I think the way there is, in my view, a fairly straightforward way to deal with the infinities, and that is just in terms of what you build into the background information. Any Bayesian calculation builds stuff into the background information that you're sort of taking as assumed. So you can just build into the background information that we are in a finite set of universes. We are one member of a finite set of universes. I mean, I don't mean committing to the multiverse. I just mean that we are in a finite set of possible universes corresponding to a finite range of the variables. And then you end up with a finite range of the variables, and then you apply the principle of indifference there. Now, you might say, well, isn't that just cheating? You're just building it into the background information. But the point is, any Bayesian calculation has to do this. Any Bayesian calculation shed loads of stuff in the background information, because otherwise you'd be dealing with every single possible alternative, and you'll get into these troubles with infinities. So again, I think it's this common thing with critiques of fine-tuning arguments of, ramping the standards of proof up to an impossible degree that you wouldn't apply in other cases. And, the only time this I think will be problematic is if you were carving up the possibilities in a contrived way that cooks the books. So, for example, suppose there's some variable that intuitively isn't fine-tuned, that there's like a really wide range of life-permitting values. If in choosing how I carve up the possible options to apply the principle of indifference, I take that intuitively really wide range of life-permitting variables and I call that all of that one possibility, and then I go to the options that don't allow for life and I carve them up in a really, really tiny way so they amount to loads of possibilities, that would be cooking the books. But I don't think it's plausible that that's what fine-tuning theories are doing. They're just working with the standard kind of ways of carving things up you get out of physics. And just very finally on this, another little bit of sneakiness or something kind of amusing. They go on to give Robin Collins's way of running the strategy I've just given, which is in terms of what he calls the epistemically illuminated region. That is to say, the range of variables that is consistent with current physics, which is limited to certain energy ranges and so on. And then they give the critique, they give the response to that. And when they do, there's pictures of dartboards and Barry Lower's talking about throwing darts at dartboards. And if you just watch this, you're thinking, why are they talking about dartboards? Now, it's because they haven't even this is confusing because they haven't even given Robin Collins' argument for his position. His argument for his position, maybe we can go into it, maybe we don't have to, involves the idea of throwing a dart at a dartboard where only the dartboard is illuminated and you don't know what's going on in other areas. To my mind, it's a pretty compelling analogy. But so they're giving the response without actually giving the argument itself, which is just, that's again sort of really the most uncharitable approach. And so it's just funny that it ends up quite confusing. Like, what are these dartboards coming from? Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Luke, feel free to share thoughts on what Philip said, but then also I know that you got your own thoughts on normalization.
Yeah, on that point about Robin Collins, it seems like Barry Lower said that it was talking about he immediately says, I think Collins' argument is just a mistake, ... And they sort of realized they'd better tell them what Collins' argument is. So they didn't do, hey, why not send Robin Collins an email and get him to at least appear on screen for 30 seconds. They get the narrator in one sentence to summarize this argument. And it's just the most minimal thing. And later on, it's going to be directed at me. So, we'll look forward to that coming. There is a very interesting debate on this. I've written a paper on it. They talk about the McGrews. It's interesting stuff. My central response to these sorts of issues is that this argument's way too strong because it would affect. We need prior probability distributions on these variables to predict anything on the constants, to predict anything from the standard model, because you've got to be able to normalize over them. You've got to be able to marginalize them, is what it's called. If you can't deal with infinite ranges of free parameters, a lot of physics is in a lot of trouble. We know how to deal with this. This isn't something weird. We've got the tools for this. We can do it. It's fine. So this argument's way too strong. But again, if we'd actually dug into it, we could have had that discussion, but it's just not in this video.
All right, why don't we go ahead, and unless either of you have more thoughts, why don't we go ahead and move on to number 6 here. Clip number 6. All right, here we go. Got it queued up.
If you think that there is fine-tuning for the constants of nature in our universe to allow for the existence of life, this is excellent evidence in favor of naturalism as opposed to theism. Because if you think about it, in theism, God can do whatever God wants. God is not constrained by the laws of physics. God does not need the laws of physics to allow certain physical configurations to exist in order for there to be life. God is infinitely powerful. God can do whatever. The only theory under which the physical conditions need to be exactly right to allow for complex chemical reactions in biology and life and so forth is naturalism. It's under naturalism that you need the constants to have the right values in order for life to exist. Under theism, life could exist under any conditions whatsoever.
Luke, why don't we start with you? This was one of the clips that you sent over.
So again, it's an interesting point. It's worth thinking through in detail. It would have been great if someone had pushed back from the other side against this argument. But anyway, so here's what I'd say in response to that. Almost all of the fine-tuning arguments that are actually sort of defended in the literature are probability arguments. Right? You don't come to the conclusion, therefore God exists. They're not any sort of proof or demonstration. They're probability arguments. You cannot do anything to a probability argument by raising mere possibilities. Logically. You cannot affect a probability argument in any way by raising mere possibilities. The whole point of the argument is that there's various open possibilities, right? If you didn't have those, you'd have a deductive argument. You'd have something that was a proof. You'd have a very solid argument. So just saying it's possible for this to happen, or this to be the case, or that to be the case, isn't something that can possibly affect the fine-tuning argument. So what it's possible for God to do, fine. I mean, there's no point, and I'll bang on about this a bit more later, there's no point at which the fine-tuning argument pretends that God must do this or must do that. So the things that are possible for God to do, the fine-tuning argument doesn't have a firm opinion on that. So it leaves open these possibilities. If you want this to affect the fine-tuning argument, you'd better start arguing about what is likely, not just what is possible. And Carroll never quite gets around to that. And so logically, his point cannot affect the fine-tuning argument. The other thing is he's sort of helping himself to a bit of a thing at the end there. It's only on naturalism that you need the constants to be right. Well, assuming that life exists, the whole point of the fine-tuning argument is that on naturalism, it's very unlikely that life would exist at all. But given that it must exist, you'd better fine-tune the parameters. That's a bit of an admission, by the way, given what was said at the start of the video, but never mind that. This is why I don't find this particular argument very compelling at all. It better come attached to some sort of probability or what's likely or this, that, and the other. Raising mere possibilities doesn't affect probability arguments.
Philip, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, a couple of things. I agree. I don't think this works against the theists. So suppose I was defending theism. I think what I would just say is, again, when we present the argument, we're building into the background information that we are in a set of universes with roughly the same structure as our universe, except you vary the numbers. And we're considering the evidence that our universe is fine-tuned. So it's already in the background information that we are in these kinds of universes that need to be fine-tuned. And that might seem like it's cheating, but that's just, again, I think that's just what you do in any Bayesian calculation. You put loads of stuff in the background so that you can just hone in on the particular piece of evidence you're considering. But secondly, this particularly doesn't bother me because when I use fine-tuning arguments, I'm not defending theism. I don't think theism is true because of the problem of evil. I just think fine-tuning is good argument. It is a good argument, good evidence for some kind of goal-directedness towards life at the fundamental level. And I think there's lots of ways of spelling that out. So I think we should really strip down the sort of bare hypothesis which fine-tuning supports, which is just some kind of goal-directedness towards life. Theists might make further arguments and push it in a theist direction, in a theistic direction. I might push it in a different direction. But once we see that's the bare claim we're defending, all these kind of points about God just kind of drop out of the story.
Luke, I wonder if this would be a helpful way to frame this objection. Are they saying, is Sean Carroll saying that the probability space on theism is larger than the probability space on naturalism, and then that's supposed to be a problem, like a larger probability space?
That might be a way of thinking about it. Well, if you think about all the possible ways the physical universe could turn out, the the problem that the fine-tuning argument is raising for naturalism is to say, look, here's all at the very least, let's just take the laws of nature as we know them, and now look at all these constants, look at all the values they could have, look at all the ways the world could have turned out. In which of them does it seem like you could get anything like the structure that life needs? Well, it's a very tiny little subset. And this response is kind of saying, well, God could make any of those universes as well, so why do you think there's any sort of improvement? And that's the thing where, you know, we think we have a reasonable answer to that, right? Some sort of goal directedness. I can map. So when the naturalist looks at that space of possibilities, there's nothing more to be said, at least at that level, until you've got a deeper theory of physics, which we can talk about later. When the theist or someone who thinks there's some sort of goal directedness behind nature looks at that, you don't carve it up according to the values just of the constants. You can carve it up according to what that universe would do as a certain outcome, because it's goal directed. You can put sort of, if you like, a probability distribution on what the universe achieves in some sense, rather than just what its initial conditions are. So you can say which of these universes will actually produce life, and then think that those form an interesting part of the probability space. So the claim of, as like, you know, theists, or more generally anyone who thinks fine-tuning is evidence of goal directedness, is that it is not that we've changed the set of possibilities. If anything, we've got there larger. It's that there's a different sort of probability structure you'd put on top of those. A god or any sort of entity who could choose a universe based on what happens in the future, what the universe is going to do, can hone in on what would otherwise be very unlikely subsets.
All right, let's move on to, unless Philip, you've had anything to add, let's go ahead and move on to clip number 7, which I thought was maybe one of the more interesting clips of the whole video. Here we go.
I think the fine-tuning argument can sometimes backfire in a way that hasn't really been noticed by people who put it forward, and that is, if you take as an assumption, which I actually think is theologically very well motivated, that not only does God have a say in the game, if God exists, but that God has a say in setting up the rules of the game. So the way you can put that in terms of cosmology is, not only does God get to choose in some sense which of the universes comes about, but he actually has a say about which are more or less likely to come about. Imagine that you believe in some infinite being who designed some sort of game for you, and you believe also that this being, so I think in a paper I wrote some time ago, I actually called this being Gob. So G-O-B, just for fun. Now imagine that you, before you play the game, you think Gob really, really likes the color purple, right? So Gob really likes the color purple, hates the color yellow, wants you're going to play this game where you're going to draw a ball out of a hat, and you know this is the preference. Gob is averse to yellow, loves purple. Okay, so now you're going to play the game, but the game is to figure out who set up the game. Okay, so you're going to play, you're going to draw the balls out of the hat. Now, of course, naturally we think evidence for Gob's existence is you draw out a purple ball, because Gob hates yellow, likes purple. Okay, so imagine now you're going to play the game. You reach down in, you pull out a ball, and it's purple. And you go, okay, I have a fine-tuning argument, right? Gob exists, because I got a purple ball. That's evidence that Gob exists. Now, imagine you get round 2 of the game. Now you get to look inside the hat. Every ball but the one you pulled out was yellow. Every single one. Now what do you do? What's your feeling about Gob's existence? I think the obvious answer is it's a big defeater to the claim that Gob exists. But this is directly analogous to the fine-tuning argument, because what we think is we got super lucky. We pulled out the universe analogy of a purple ball, a universe in which life exists. However, we look at the landscape of possible universes, and it's an incredibly rare possibility. My reaction, which I think in that case is that's evidence against God's existence.
So Luke, this was another one of your clips. What are your thoughts on this?
I think this is really interesting and worth thinking through. Here's where I think actually all that stuff about probability interpretations now sort of comes home to roost, because what's in the ball and hat example, what's generating the probabilities? Well, it's very clearly that you just have it's frequentist. You just have numbers that you can count, and so if you ask why is it improbable that you would, if you picked at random, get the purple ball out of all the yellow ones, that probability comes to you from just the numbers, purely the numbers. You just do frequentism. You can just count. You have a counting metric, piece of cake. Where does the improbability come from in fine tuning? It's the claim of fine tuning in the sort of Bayesian presentation that we were talking about before, objective Bayesian. The small probabilities are not just a fact about the way physics is laid out, so to speak. In the language that was used actually Hans Halvorsen is using there, all we have is a measure, right, which is not a probability yet. It's just some way of taking some subset and putting a number on it, but we haven't interpreted those numbers yet. What turns the measure into a probability, into a likelihood, is the assumption of naturalism, that there is nothing else at the level we're considering naturalism. Let's treat the laws of nature as being the deepest level that there is, just as we don't have any deeper level, so let's just do things here for the moment. So here's the point. What's generating the low probabilities in the example is just pure numbers. What's generating the low probabilities in the case of fine-tuning is not purely the physics, but the assumption of naturalism. You have to throw that in on top, and then you get low probabilities. Otherwise, you've just got a measure. You have to say, what's the likelihood that this sort of universe would exist, in which case it matters how this universe came about, right? Which is not what's there in the game. So the reason why this isn't a worry, this isn't a problem for God, so to speak, is that it's not that there is this low probability that just exists there and that God has somehow created. There's a whole bunch of possibilities. You only get a low probability if you assume God doesn't exist. If God exists, then there's no low probability there. The probability space changes entirely because you're asking the question what God might want to create. So the reason why it's not analogous to fine tuning is because we're in a Bayesian context, and in Bayesian contexts, probabilities are generated by hypotheses, right? Especially likelihoods. Likelihoods are generated by hypotheses. There's no raw probabilities here. There's no just the probability of X, simpliciter. They're generated by hypotheses. The low probabilities in fine-tuning are generated by naturalism. That's the whole point of the argument. So saying it's not that God's made a universe in which life is really unlikely. It's life looks really unlikely if you assume there's no God. That's the point of the argument. So that's where I think this very interesting and example fails to actually be analogous to fine tuning. But that would be my response to that. But again, it's an interesting case.
Yeah, it was very helpful. I like the way that you kind of laid that out. Philip, any thoughts? I don't imagine you're going to have much pushback, but
it'd be nice if we could find something me and Luke disagreed on, wouldn't it? It's an interesting argument. It's a cool paper, and Luke's response.
I even like the name of Gob.
Yeah,
funny
cool. I think Luke's response sounds plausible to me, but just to repeat again, in this context, this is particularly not a problem for me, given that I'm not defending theism. So I'm sympathetic to, for example, among a range of possibilities, I'm sympathetic to the idea of a designer of limited powers, of limited abilities. And on that hypothesis, you'd explain the improbability of life in terms of the limitations of the designer. The designer is limited in terms of the form of physics it can work with. But then we then explain why life has come out against that backdrop of improbability in terms of the decisions of this designer to try to bring about life. So again, if we just strip down fine-tuning to it being conceived of as evidence for some kind of goal-directedness, I think all these worries slip away. Just one more point that just of interest. Maybe this connects a little bit more to what they go on to talk about, which is they try to say there's there's a tension with theists sometimes responding to the problem of evil by saying, well, we don't know enough about the mind of God to know whether God would allow the kind of suffering we see. This is the skeptical theist response. And they say, well, there's a tension here. Barry Lower comes up and says there's a tension between we know enough of the mind of God to say that God would fine-tune things, but we don't know enough about the mind of God to say that God, whether or not God would allow evil. I think that's a good point, but it's one many theists respect, actually. Hudson is an example of someone who makes the skeptical theist response to the problem of evil, and because of that, he rejects the fine-tuning argument. He thinks it would sort of be inconsistent for him to also go for the fine-tuning argument. So I'm not a fan of skeptical theism myself, but just to point out there's an interesting that's probably one of the few points of the video I agreed with, but some theists accept that as well.
Yeah, that is a fascinating topic, skeptical theism, and then the overlap between that and natural theology. Luke, I was thinking to maybe make your point a little bit more visual for people. So I think what you were saying is that the visual that they give of the hat with the mostly yellow balls and the one purple ball, that is what we're assuming is happening given naturalism in a Bayesian context, right? That's what the picture looks like on the naturalistic hypothesis. But if we were to switch and move to the theistic hypothesis, then the hat would be full of purple balls in that case, right? Because we're switching hypotheses. What would we expect? If theism were true, we'd expect to find a hat full of purple balls. Does that help explain what your thought is?
I guess so. That the changing, there's not the probability,
right?
And then you're trying to think about the hypotheses. That in this case the hypotheses are generating the probabilities. This is all likelihoods in Bayesian context are generated by hypotheses. This is the whole point. Yeah.
Okay. It's conditional, isn't it? It's the conditional of the evidence on the hypothesis. It's kind of built into the way we do Bayesian calculations.
Mm-hmm. And so on theism, what you would expect is you would expect to find life. You would expect that most of the universes that God would create would be purple in a sense. Okay, here's number 8, in which Luke is slandered. Here we go.
Fine-tuning is the claim that the probabilities for life are low. Yet advocates of the argument, like Luke Barnes, claim that life would be likely given theism.
Just give me a minute here while I read. Okay, what seems to have happened there is what happened before, that Barry Lower's going to go on in the next clip to mention my name. And so they thought, oh, we better mention who Luke Barnes is. And so what they literally just said there was, advocates of the argument like Luke Barnes claim that life would be likely given theism. And that is exactly not what I say. So if you all open your books to page 341, all I say is at the top of the page, a universe capable of producing and sustaining life forms, such creatures, is a universe with moral worth, one that God might create. This might, it seems, is enough. Moving on, only an extraordinary strong assumption against the idea that God would want to create a universe with embodied moral agents will affect our conclusions. So in a paper I wrote recently called A Reasonable Little Question, which is about sort of the way I lay out the fine-tuning argument, premise 3 is, quote, the likelihood that a life-permitting universe exists on theism is not vanishingly small. Right? I don't say likely, I say not vanishingly small. And that makes an enormous difference because everyone's about to go on and whinge and complain that how can you possibly know that things are likely on theism? How can you know that God had to do it this way? And I got mentioned, but no fine-tuning defender defends the idea that that life would be likely given theism. You don't need that for the argument because it's a comparison. You compare the likelihood of a life-permitting universe on naturalism with the likelihood of a life-permitting universe on theism if you're just doing a straight shootout between those two. If you're looking more broadly like Phil is, then you'll consider more things. But in the structure of the argument, what matters is not the absolute value of that likelihood, which is I'm being told, I'm saying is likely, which I would interpret as being more than a half. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's just not vanishingly small, whereas the likelihood of a life-permitting universe on naturalism is vanishingly small. Now, you might try to defend the video at this point by saying, look, Barry Lower mentioned my name. I was at a conference, fine-tuning conference, and Barry Lower gave a talk there. He's great. I like Barry a lot. In which he had 2 slides in which he just had Barnes' mistake number 1, and then the next slide was Barnes' mistake number 2. And there was sort of philosophers and physicists in the room, and the physicists were like, "Whoa, dude, what are you doing here?" But the philosophers knew that this is how philosophy is done. Like, of course you're going to interact with someone's opinions beliefs very directly. It seems like Barry mentioned me, Barry Lower, and then they just had to throw in something about me just to put things in context. However, and you might think, oh, they just weren't fully aware of my views on this. However, Skydive Phil sat through one of my talks on fine-tuning. I did a talk there's an unbelievable radio group, Justin Briley, in London. They invited me on. I gave a talk. Phil was in the audience. We had a chat afterwards over Zoom. He knows what I think. And so if he's understood anything about what I think, about how the argument works, he must know that sentence is false. Luke Barnes does not claim that life would be likely given theism. I don't need that. I don't think it's true. It's not there. So I won't repeat what I said out loud when I watched that part of the video for the first time. I was just happy the kids weren't in the house. But this is a real issue with this video that I'd have been on it, man. Send me an email. I'll record, 30 seconds of what I actually think, and then you can actually have someone defend the argument in their own words anywhere in this video. But instead of that, they just got a screenshot of my university page and then signed a straw man opinion to me that I have in numerous places in print denied.
I wanted to say something about the way that probability works in a Bayesian context, in that if you've got, because you're comparing 2 hypotheses, right? You were comparing naturalism and theism. And what I think people have a hard time understanding is if on naturalism, it's, as you say, vanishingly improbable that you'd have a life-permitting universe, you can still really strongly confirm theism over naturalism, even if on theism it's still very unlikely, but it's not vanishingly unlikely. So even though you've got this sort of both hypotheses, the data is unlikely on both hypotheses, as long as it's way more unlikely on one of the hypotheses, you're still going to get confirmation of the other hypothesis. And I think that what people want is they want to be able to say, well, it's got to be unlikely on one hypothesis and then likely on the other. That's the only way you're going to get confirmation. But in Bayesianism, it doesn't work that way. You can still get confirmation. So I wanted to just kind of highlight that. And if either of you have thoughts, feel free to share.
Yeah, just quickly on that. That's the way it works. So, for example, if I walk into my room here and I find a message on the board of, to take your son to cricket practice later on today, written on ink on the board, and I'm thinking, did my wife write that, or did the pen just like fall off the top here and write it by accident on the way down? I don't at any point need to say that before I walked in the room, I think it's likely that my wife would have written that on the board. All that matters is that it's very, very, very ludicrously unlikely that a falling pen would have written it on the board. That's all I need. And let me take a second here to call out something else in the video. Hans Halvorsen has written a lot of stuff about the fine-tuning argument, and some very good and interesting stuff. But a lot of what he says in this video are some real straw men. And it's really quite confusing to me. So he says, we saw that he laid out the interpretations of fine-tuning, that there's these three and we can't do fine-tuning on any of them, when it's not any of those. It's the fourth one, objective Bayesian, which is not mentioned. He says, there's not to my mind been anything resembling a convincing argument that we have one true measure of probabilities. No fine-tuning advocate says there is one true measure, so that's not a problem. He says, as soon as you say God can't do that, I think the theistic arguer is in a very hazardous situation, except no theistic arguer says anything like God can't do that. And he says, quote, the fine-tuning argument depends crucially on the assumption that God favors life-permitting universes. And if that's supposed to mean what was attributed to me, that life-permitting universes are likely given theism, that's obviously false as well. No fine-tuning sort of supporter defends that premise either. And again, I found Halvorsen sort of making interesting points against arguments that no one makes. And I'm quite worried about that, because Hans has some really interesting stuff to say about the argument. But these straw men are just sort of throwing things against the wall, attacking an opponent that's not there.
All I want to add just briefly is, it's kind of frustrating, because just think of the incredible film they could have made, because there's so many great points in this and so many great figures. If they just presented both, why is it so scary to the makers of this film to present the experts on both sides and let the viewers make their own mind up? And I mean, just you make the connection to Unbelievable. That Unbelievable came up because they brought in an episode of Unbelievable. This is the Christian versus non-Christian debating podcast, and in which they got skydivephil on with a Christian who doesn't buy the fine-tuning argument. And, just contrast on Unbelievable, they calmly, respectfully present both sides of the argument. Now, how did they use that clip in this video? They just use it to say, haha, even theists reject the fine-tuning argument. It's childish. It's childish, it's intellectually dishonest, and I think it's rooted in, I don't know, I shouldn't speculate about, but it suggests a certain fear of just honestly presenting both sides of the story. If I speak to people, if they've ever heard of fine-tuning, they think it's been debunked, right? Whereas the relevant experts are split on this issue, philosophers and physicists. Why not present both sides, let the viewer make their mind up? What's so scary about that?
All right, let's move on. Let's move on to we got two more clips. This is number 9, and it's talking about Boltzmann brains.
The Boltzmann brain problem is weird in how people have sort of latched onto it. It's a very specific problem. If a very specific set of things happen, namely, the universe lasts forever, and as it's lasting forever, there are random thermal fluctuations within it, then we should get Boltzmann brains, and we should have a very different universe than what we see. But neither one of those assumptions are automatic, even if you believe in a multiverse. Maybe it's a finite amount of time, but much more likely, the way the multiverse exists and evolves over time is just completely different than random thermal fluctuations. That's a very easy thing to set up. So the Boltzmann brain problem is not a statement that the multiverse is in trouble because there are too many Boltzmann brains. It's just a statement that you should avoid those particular versions of the multiverse which are dominated by Boltzmann brains. That's not that hard to do.
So, Luke.
So there's a logical problem here. You can't say, I've got this range of hypotheses that I think are live, and I'm going to try to explain the data in terms of one of them, and yet a bunch of them have a problem. Oh, all that's telling me is not to use those to focus on the other lot in the set. The problem there is that's not how Bayesian testing works. If you had a bunch of live options open, which get some decent fraction of the prior probability, and then they get ruled out by data, if they come under a sort of broad heading of things you're interested in, what that means is a bunch of your your probabilities take a hit because of that. They have to take a hit. The probability of the multiverse does go down in general if it turns out that a lot of multiverses have this specific problem. Specifically, I know people get confused over this, but the question is, if you think you've got an idea about how the whole universe works, ask the question of your model, because it's how the whole universe works. So you should be able to ask it anything. What sort of life form is most likely to turn up in the universe? Is it a life form like us, which happens on a planet and after a consistent evolutionary history, which builds things up in consistent ways, or is it a kind of life form which just sort of appears by chance in a very small region of order amidst chaos? And if it turns out that second option is much more likely than the first one, your model's got a problem because it's making a false prediction. It would predict that if you're an observer, you're probably a chancy observer rather than a Boltzmann brain, as it were, rather than someone like us. You can't, look, this is not how Bayesian theory testing works. If an idea, if a bunch of ideas within your bigger idea makes a bunch of false predictions, then it does get affected. Its probability has to go down. You can't just use that to, after the fact, post hoc, just rule out the ones that didn't actually explain the data, beforehand. And so the other thing I wanted to say there is, Carroll tries to say it's a very specific problem with a very specific set of things. There's two things. You've got universes that last forever. That's not technically true, but close enough. And universes that have random thermal fluctuations. Those are really general conditions. There's loads of cosmologies that have an infinite future, at least on paper, and there's random fluctuations are exactly the sort of thing you would expect in any universe where there's matter around. This isn't the sort of temp. I seem slow on the screen. Just wait for myself to come back.
You seem to be frozen.
Yeah.
Okay. You're back.
I think I'm back. The attempt to say that these are very specific, narrow conditions is not convincing at all. So Carroll says there are versions of the multiverse which don't have these problems. Yet that's correct. The question is whether you have to fine-tune them in order to avoid this problem, or whether they are in fact generically avoid this problem. And that's very much an open question.
Philip, do you have any thoughts on? I know this is maybe not your area of expertise, Boltzmann brains,
just briefly. I suspect what's going on in Sean Carroll's mind here is he just doesn't take the God hypothesis seriously from the start. And if you're starting from that position and you think fine-tuning needs explaining, you're going to fix up the multiverse to get around this. And, it seems like that could be done. Whereas I think, Luke's right. If you're taking both of these options seriously, of course, there's another option as you think, there's big problems with theism because of the problem of evil. There's this Boltzmann brain problem for the multiverse. Maybe we should look for other alternative hypotheses. That would be my own approach. But Luke, actually, can I ask you a question? I was interested in your argument in your book that multiverse in the dialogue chapter of your book with Geraint, where you say, well, that they might have to be fine-tuned. Look, you should advertise it. He's paying me to ask this question. Has that been written up in like a paper anywhere that multiverse models would have to be fine-tuned to get around the Boltzmann brain thing?
So let me have a think. Multiverse models being fine-tuned in general. Actually, this was addressed to some extent in the video. Inflationary models. There's various fine-tuning issues there. There's a summary of those. I wrote a review paper back in 2012. So you can find some things in the literature on that. But you have to be fine-tuned to get around the Boltzmann brain problem. One of the worries here is there's no single multiverse theory. There's sort of sets of theories. it's a sort of broad and weirdly thrown together family of theories. So off the top of my head, I'm not entirely sure. There's probably something, I just can't think of it off the top of my head. But yeah, the worry is it's quite hard to be general, because there's not really a target to aim at. It's something that a specific multiverse theory could fail on. So famously, one of the very first multiverse theories, Boltzmann's multiverse theory, Ludwig Boltzmann, succumbs to this problem, as Arthur Eddington pointed out, I think in the early 1930s. But more generally, because multiverses are such a broad, weird class of toy models, it's hard to pin them down.
So is it just that, like, if you were just trying to put together a multiverse under the most natural assumptions, maybe to explain fine tuning, you'd probably end up with bolts and brains? Is that the thought? Or
if that's true, then it would turn out that the multiverse doesn't explain the universe we see around us, in the sense that you ask the question, what would I expect to observe if the multiverse were true? And the answer is not this. And so your probability has to take a hit out of that, because it's failed to explain. It's failed to make something likely, which we know is true. Now, remember, we said all that stuff about Bayes before. You don't actually have to make things likely. You just have to make things more likely than the other available hypotheses. So it could still turn out to be the most likely thing, but you've got to take that into account when you're balancing these probabilities.
so they can't just say, just one more time, sorry. So the multiverse theories couldn't just say, which I think is what Geraint, your co-author, says, well, it's just two bits of data here. There's two constraints. One, explain the fine-tuning, and one to deal with bolts and brains. We just need to come up with a theory that accounts for both, satisfies both constraints. Isn't that?
Yeah. So, I mean, so I guess one way you could say this is that multiverse theories, you can't just say, well, this universe, or a universe like this, or a universe with life forms like us, would turn up somewhere, and hey presto, that's all we've done, we've explained the data. The problem is, you could, if you have a multiverse which also generates a whole bunch of people who think they're Luke Barnes talking in a room, but are actually not, and all of this is fake, I'm just having some sort of hallucination. If those are much more likely than me, then I guess my model's kind of shot itself in the foot, or in the head. So again, that's the way that the Boltzmann brain problem can kill a particular multiverse. If you're considering the set of multiverses and most of them have this problem, then the multiverse as a big idea has got a real problem. The worry is, I mean, I actually think Sean, given the same data, I would say that this is a very general problem. If all I need is universes that last forever and random thermal fluctuations, I've got real problems. Those will be all over the place. There's a very specific reason related to the way that Sean interprets quantum mechanics, why he thinks he can make a universe which doesn't ultimately, in the long run, have thermal fluctuations. But it's a very particular outcome, very particular scenario, which we can go into in detail. You can go. I had to follow Sean at a conference once where he presented that, and then I had to try and follow Sean. Very intimidating. Yeah.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and now turn to the last clip, which is on the low entropy and whether this is a problem for fine-tuning. And then we'll turn to, we have had a couple questions that have come in. I don't anticipate getting a whole lot today. We'll see if people want to engage, but this is an invite, though. If you'd like to send in a super chat, then we'll try to do what we can to get to those. That's what I was referencing earlier, that we've had a couple
of super chats come in. We'll get to those. The chat. I didn't notice the chat.
Yeah. Been pretty active, so pretty cool. All right, here's clip number 10, and we'll get some responses.
I'm of the belief that the fact that our early universe had low entropy is a huge problem for modern cosmology. Problem in the sense of a puzzle we need to solve. Not that it's unsolvable, it's extremely solvable. I have suggested solutions for it with my colleague Jennifer Chen. We proposed a multiverse model which would explain why our early universe had low entropy. But the anthropic principle does not by itself solve it. With that, I agree with Roger Penrose, because the early universe's low entropy is much, much lower than it needs to be to allow for the existence of life. So I would take that as a strike against those who want to explain fine-tuning using God, because here's an example of a fine-tuning that was not just for us to exist, right? It was clearly some dynamical mechanism that has nothing to do with the existence of life, yet we have some fine-tuning to be explained. It could very well be that other fine-tunings have similar dynamical explanations.
So, Luke.
I can be quick on this one. His argument, so there's a lot of interesting stuff there about entropy, which I'd love to dive into. His argument that the very low entropy of our universe is a strike against sort of theism, because it's let me say it again, so I don't misrepresent it. It's a strike against those who want to explain fine-tuning using God, because here's an example of a fine-tuning that was not just for us to exist. So it was clearly some dynamical mechanism. Right, here's an example of a fine-tuning that is not just for us to exist. Now, the problem there is that, again, it's just smuggling in an assumption that fine-tuning arguments don't make. There's no assumption in fine-tuning arguments that the only reason this universe exists is for life forms like us. That's not any part of it. That only has to be one of the reasons. There could be other reasons that a designer or something goal-directed might have for the universe. So I mean, the worry there is that's a sort of another reason why things might turn out differently to the way they are now. But there's just no assumption in the fine-tuning argument, as often as people try to make it say this, that the universe is just for us. So you sometimes see people could, the fine-tuning argument is just arrogance. We just assume that the universe is here for us because we're here and aren't we so important? I mean, people might think that, but it's not the fine-tuning argument. So if you don't have that assumption, there's not really a problem here. Our universe has the necessary conditions for life in terms of entropy, in terms of there being order in the early universe. If it turns out there's way more sort of free energy, low entropy conditions around than we specifically need, but that's fine. It's a problem for the multiverse, as he points out, which is what he means by an anthropic explanation, which is why he's saying it must be something dynamical. There's various reasons to be skeptical of that claim as well. But the point I want to make is that, once again, the attack on the fine-tuning argument has to import an assumption into the fine-tuning argument that it never makes. It's a straw man.
So one thing I think, Philip, you may agree with this too, is that I think there's maybe a way of framing Sean Carroll's worry here. So instead of making it like an objection to the fine-tuning argument, maybe what he's saying is that there's just other data that's relevant here, like low entropy, that is some evidence against theism. Maybe I'm trying to be as charitable as I can with his argument. So maybe he wouldn't necessarily be committing himself to the view that fine-tuning suggests that there wouldn't be low entropy at the beginning of the universe. But he could just say that data is surprising on theism and therefore is evidence for naturalism over theism. Do you have Luke, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think I think the worry that Sean is always sort of has in the air, his main objection to theism is it doesn't really predict anything. It doesn't, it's not a good theory of the universe. I think he almost has there's a talk of his on the internet, that's almost the title, not quite. I can't remember what it exactly is. That basically
we were gonna respond to it.
Oh yeah, that one. Yeah.
We need
another thing we didn't do in 2022. So his point there is that these theists just make everything up after the fact. It's just the ultimate ad hoc hypothesis. Whatever happens, you just say there's a God who wanted exactly this. Actually, I think Barry Lois says some fairly similar things in this video. That is a worry, of course. The question of whether that in any way affects the issue. One of the things so this whole issue, one of the things we pointed out previously on this channel, Cameron, when I was on with Aaron Wall, was that Sean often pits theism up against a physical hypothesis, against a scientific theory, and says, hey, theism doesn't make predictions like scientific theories make predictions. And that's the wrong comparison, because I'm allowed to have scientific theories as well, right? I'm a theist. I'm a scientist. The comparison is theism versus naturalism. So you've got to ask yourself, what does naturalism predict here? Or lead us to expect? That's the comparison. Taking out naturalism and pretending you can just sort of pop a scientific theory in there and then make that comparison and say, hey, that's not as predictive, is just the wrong comparison, because theism and any scientific theory you've got could both be true.
The way I would put it maybe is that theism may not predict low entropy, but neither does naturalism. So it's not as if you've got low entropy confirming one hypothesis over the other. It's just sort of neutral.
Yeah, at worst, it's neutral.
Yeah.
You can't have it both ways. Can you say that theism doesn't predict anything, but it predicts, its predictions are in tension with the low entropy data? It might be a similar issue to what they're accusing skeptical theists who adopt the fine-tuning hypothesis of. That on the one hand they're saying, oh, theism doesn't make predictions about suffering, but it does make predictions about there being life. I just want to quickly take the opportunity to educate myself and ask Luke on this entropy stuff. I think, if I'm remembering rightly, in Robin Collins' massive paper on this, he links his Boltzmann brain critique to these low entropy issues and thinks that any I can't remember how it goes now. Any multiverse that deals with Boltzmann brains is going to be.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know what it is. Can you make that clear to me? Because I've always it's just got above my pay grade to deal with, understand.
So the connection is that a Boltzmann brain will be a random thermal fluctuation. Well, the most common sort of way, how am I going to get an observer in the universe, which is not like the way we came around with a consistent history and evolution and all that? And the answer is, things, the atoms just happen to throw themselves together in the right way. And then here I am having some thoughts with a brain and stuff. So the connection is the question of, our universe as we observe it, that has very, I'll say, special in a very precise physical sense, initial conditions. In that we can imagine what a typical Big Bang might look like, a high entropy Big Bang, a Big Bang without a lot of useful energy around. And it's what would happen if the universe recollapsed. This is Roger Penrose's argument, that the universe would have been born with all of the energy trapped in forms where it's unusable, which means black holes, is what Penrose says. So there's something special about the start of our universe. And the question is, okay, maybe, and this is one of the hypotheses that Sean is rejecting, right? So let's just be clear about that. Maybe just in the hubbub, in the chaos of the universe as a whole, eventually something like our beginning of the universe, something like that Big Bang, just turns up somewhere at random as a fluctuation. And that's how you explain the universe around us. If you've got that as your starting position, then we're fine. Everything else will follow from that. The response to that is that it's much more likely that we get to today directly with a fluctuation, because today is a higher entropy condition, a less ordered condition. It's much more likely you would fluctuate. Whatever's making weirdo universes would just make today, or would just make me thinking that I'm here today. That's an easier thing to fluctuate at random than the entire universe 13.7 billion years ago. That's roughly how it goes.
Okay, I think I get that. But then what if I suppose I'm a multiverse theorist? What if I say in response, okay, well, I have a multiverse account of fine-tuning, but I give some other account of the low entropy, like the one Sean Carroll prefers, that's nothing to do with the multiverse. How would Robin Collins...
That's fine. Yeah, look, if you've got some some theory that supposedly does it, then great. Do some physics if you like. That's fine. We're fine with that. There's a lot to say about that Carroll and Chen argument, model, but I won't start getting into that. I would love it, Cameron, if you got Aaron Wall to come on here and chat about that model for an hour. Might be the only one in the audience, but that would be amazing.
I'll come.
I think it's a really interesting idea so if you've got a multiverse model which avoids where the most likely form of life is us and not Boltzmann brains, great, right? Fantastic. The question's not whether you can, in the space of multiverse models, whether you can find them, but whether that in itself is a very fine-tuned thing, or whether most don't worry about it. This Boltzmann brain thing's like a couple of isolated problems, but don't worry about it. Which is what the impression Sean's trying to give, and I don't think that's actually correct. But
yeah, it's that bit obnoxious when he says it's not a problem, get over it in the video. I think you cut that off just before it went on to that. But
yeah,
he's a lovely bloke, really.
It looks so unnatural. I wonder if Phil asked him to say it, but anyway, skydivephil, sorry.
Okay, why don't we now turn to some questions that have come in. So here's one from very early on. Whoops, I've got it all formatted incorrectly here. Let me see if I can get it up where it needs to be. All right, here it is from Sage. Luke Barnes, love your work. Trent Horn made some great use of a Fortunate Universe in a recent vid he did on his podcast, and I picked it up. Can't wait to dive in, as the misrepresentation of fine-tuning is indeed such a problem.
Nice, yeah, good. I should say, so Geraint's an atheist, my co-author, and so we wrote 7 chapters together, and the 8th chapter is a discussion between the two of us. So that's the way it's laid out. Chapter 7 is entirely about a dozen or so reactions to fine-tuning, where so it's all there.
That chapter, which chapter is it where you have the discussion between the two of you? 7? That's like
8. Sorry, 8.
Whole book.
Yeah,
it's
8.
really great. I always recommend that to my students. That chapter.
Yeah, and the whole book is written in a really accessible and like fun way. Like it's really fun and funny. And I mean, Luke's personality definitely shines through there.
And you're both so clued up about the philosophy. It's really great. I mean, as is Sean Carroll. It's great to see scientists who are really clued up about the philosophy as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, just a couple more questions, and then we'll close it out. From Bilbo Baggins, none other than Bilbo. Luke is awesome, and Philip might be the most likable guy around. Never gave the fine-tuning argument too much time, but am really growing to appreciate it. Just a really nice comment.
Sounds like he's going on an adventure.
Maybe so. Maybe so. Thank you guys for your super chats. Really appreciate it. Okay, moving on to a question from James. Luke, can you address the non-bias argument by Penrose in The Emperor's New Mind, that the fine-tuning supports the strong anthropic principle that argues the ability to create AGI? What is AGI?
I have The Emperor's New Mind behind me. I'm wondering what he's talking about, though. The non-bias argument that fine-tuning supports the strong anthropic principle, misspelled, that argues... what's AGI? Sorry, James, I'm not entirely sure what...
is it artificial general intelligence? Artificial general intelligence?
I don't think that's in... Is that in here somewhere? It's been a while. Sorry, it's been a while since I've read Emperor's New Mind.
See, if you had the Kindle version, you could just go in and search for...
I could just go, yeah, sorry, it's been a bit too long. Penrose is pretty great to read on all of these sorts of issues. I feel like he's being forced. So I actually did a blog post. There was a previous sort of interview with Penrose, and I felt like they were chopping it up in such weird ways. Skydivephil was that it gave sort of strange impressions about what Penrose actually thinks about fine tuning. But you can go and read that blog post if you're interested.
All right, here's a question. Yeah, while you're doing that, I can ask a different question from Callum S. He says, Capturing Christianity, I remember a few years back that Robin Collins was working on the argument for discovering the universe. Has that argument progressed much, or has it dwindled? So, Luke, do you have any like inside information on what he's?
Anytime I'm within earshot of Robin, I tell him to publish his book, and he still hasn't. So Robin started writing a book about fine tuning, and then discovered a couple of interesting cases where if you change the constants, you'd still have life, but that the life would find the universe much more difficult to understand, to sort of discover what's going on around here in a way that we've been able to at least discover some stuff about the universe. And that's a harder case to make, but I think there are some clear-cut cases there. And that's kind of interesting. The reason why he's interesting in that is there's no way the multiverse is explaining that kind of fine-tuning. And so that's a really interesting kind of argument. Again, he's sitting on an entire book that I'm literally slated to. He's lined me up to, review it several times. I'm just waiting for it to turn up in my inbox. But yeah, if you see Robin, tell him to publish the sodding book.
I don't have much to add, but I was just doesn't he also have some arguments that the universe is fine-tuned for the possibility of technology? I think I remember him saying on a podcast or something.
Yeah, there's an interesting paper of his that I've read. I'm not sure if he actually published it, that of how much you would need to change the strength of electromagnetism, the fine structure constant, in order that you couldn't make wood fires. And it's kind of interesting you can do that calculation. Again, it's harder to do, and it's harder to argue that this could or couldn't happen. But it's at least interesting to attempt to think about.
Well, and then one of the other things that I've at least heard about it is that it also avoids the normalization problem. Is that correct, Luke?
No, that's not obvious to me. If you're thinking, you're still trying to compare the set of values in which you can make a fire or discover some stuff about the universe with the whole possible set. And it's the size of that possible set which supposedly creates the problem. So if it does, that's not obvious to me.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, well, we don't have any other questions that have come in. I'm sure that after I say that, and when I say that we don't have any more, we're going to get a flood of questions. But I think that we're probably best slated to just kind of close it out for today and get some closing thoughts from... Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I've been drinking beer while we've been doing this. I'm probably getting a bit too drunk now to articulate coherent thought anyway, so...
It's 9 a.m.
Oh, yeah,
Australia, so I haven't started yet.
I was kind of wondering what you were drinking there, but thank you for revealing that. Okay, let's get some closing thoughts. What kind of? Well, let me ask you, what kind of beer is that?
This was the first one,
Yeah,
Sol,
solid.
and then this was the second one.
Well, you haven't told me what kind it is. Is it an ale?
Pilsner. This is Pilsner.
Pilsner. Okay.
This is my last. Going to bed after.
Okay. Okay. Just as I predicted, we did have a question that's come in, so let's get to this one and then we'll close it out. All right, from Nicholas Tan, $10 super chat. Thank you so much. I've heard that cosmic inflation A solves the fine-tuning problem by creating new bubble universes with all different constants, or B makes it worse. Which is it?
It's supposed to be a part of a multiverse theory. So you make lots of bits of the universe with lots of different constants, and then a universe with the right set or a life-permitting set will turn up somewhere, and then life only asks, why am I in this universe? In universes in which there is life. So inflation is supposed to help fine-tuning problems by generating a multiverse. So in that sense, I don't think it makes it worse. The question is whether it generates fine-tuning problems of its own, because all you've done is taken. Actually, it's not a small thing, but you've taken a bunch of things which we think are sort of fundamental constants of our universe and made them actually things that vary from place to place. But a multiverse theory of any kind, and especially inflation, will have more constants in whatever the thing is that makes the universe blow up and expand. So there's a question of whether you've just pushed the fine-tuning back or whether you've actually sort of solved it. That's an open question.
I should probably throw in, actually, I'm surprised I haven't done as yet. My objection to the multiverse explanation of fine tuning. So I used to think the multiverse was the obvious response. I've got no axe to grind here, but I've been persuaded by philosophers of probability that there is just a fallacious line of reasoning here, and this is one of the things I'm quite excited about. My new book. Luke's been advertising his book, but I've just signed a contract with Oxford University Press for a book that's going to come out next November, I think. The Purpose of Existence, between God and atheism, arguing against both God and atheism and considering a range of hypotheses in between. And anyway, what persuaded me that the multiverse isn't an explanation? So why I'm excited is this isn't my argument. It's been in the philosophy literature for decades, but it's a typical example of academics talking to themselves, and nobody knows about it outside of academic philosophy, despite the huge interest in this fine-tuning business. So very briefly, the charge is that the inference from fine-tuning to a multiverse commits the inverse gambler's fallacy. So just briefly give the analogy. So suppose Luke and I walk into a casino one night, and the first person we see is this guy having an incredible run of luck. He's just winning and winning, rolling double six after double six, and we're amazed. And I say, "Wow, Luke, there must be lots of people playing in the casino tonight." And Luke says, "What do you mean? Why would you think that?" And I say, "Well, if there's just one person playing in the casino tonight, then it's incredibly improbable that there'd be someone in the casino having such an amazing run of luck. Whereas if there's loads and loads of people playing in a casino tonight, it's not so surprising that statistically one person is going to have an incredible run of luck." Now, I'm sure Luke would respond to me, that is a fallacy. That is a fallacy, because all we've actually observed is this one dude, and whether or not there are other people playing the casino has no bearing on whether this one person we've observed is having a good run of luck or not. So everyone agrees that's a fallacy, the inverse gambler's fallacy, and the charge is, at least if we're inferring from the fine-tuning to a multiverse, the reasoning looks strikingly similar. Alan Guth says, "Oh, look, how improbable our universe is fine-tuned for life. There must be loads of universes with rubbish numbers." But the correct response, I think, is, well, no, all we've observed is one universe, and no matter how many other universes there is, it doesn't have any bearing on whether the one universe we've observed is or is not fine-tuned. Now, there's lots of things to bring in here. Okay, what about independent scientific evidence? What about the anthropic selection effect? Here you add to the analogy that there's a shooter, what do you call someone who shoots people? Sniper, waiting to shoot us as we walk in if someone has a great run of luck. So there's a sort of artificial selection effect. Anyway, there's lots to be said, and you can hear all about it in my new book, which I'm also hoping is going to be the most accessible introduction to Bayesian reasoning ever written. But I'm just persuaded it's just not an option, the multiverse, which is why we have to turn to some kind of cosmic teleology. Weird as it is, unexpected as it is, we should follow the Enlightenment goal of following the evidence where it leads and facing up to the difficulties.
I'm afraid to ask Luke for his thoughts on that, because we're trying to close out the show, but
they are long and confused. So let's just leave it at, yeah.
Okay.
I don't quite buy that objection, I have to say.
We had a discussion of it, didn't we, Geraint, as well, on which podcast was that? Was that Christian Idealism?
Somewhere on the internet. I don't remember. Sorry.
Oh no! It's the opposite. It was the atheist podcast. Really good physicist atheist. What's it called? Skeptical physicalism.
I'm not going to remember. Sorry. Okay.
I don't even know what you're talking about. Okay, let's move on to a question from writer John Buck, and I'm doing this one because he sent it in way earlier and I missed it. So he's wanting to go back to the purple ball analogy. He says the purple ball analogy is way off because we aren't the ones pulling the ball out; it's the fine tuner. So them picking a purple ball instead of a yellow is expected if the fine tuner likes purple.
So I don't think that's quite getting at it. So the pulling the ball out in the analogy is the what universe you end up in. So sorry, Phil, I just looked it up. Physically Debunked is the name of it.
Physically Debunked. Yeah, for the discussion about that me, Luke, and Geraint had. It's good podcast.
Anyway, so I don't think that's where the analogy goes. So the pulling the ball out is which universe do you find yourself in? And I think that's the equivalent of that. So it's not that we made the universe rather than the fine tuner. There is something a bit weird there that, what about all these other universes where, life supposedly can't exist? And again, the point I'm making is it's only improbable if you put what's generating the probabilities. It's naturalism that creates that improbability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think another point that he wanted to make is that it's Gob is the one who created the game. He's the one who gave you the hat with the balls, right? And that's the analogy is supposed to be that God is the one who's sort of created the physical landscape, and so he's the one who's made it such that it's really unlikely that you're going to get a life-permitting universe. But your point is that that's not actually the case, because from the hypotheses, that's what generates the probabilities. But yeah, okay. I think let's now move to some just closing thoughts, some overall thoughts about the video, about the dialogue today, and doesn't have to be long. But if you don't have any, that's okay too. We can just close it out. But Luke, let's start with you.
Yeah, look, I appreciate a lot someone who's gone to this much effort to go and actually talk to people who know about these sorts of things. So I got a lot of respect for that. And as I said, actually, there's various parts of the video that I agree with and other parts that are worth responding to. The worry I have is this. It's an impression that someone, and we sort of saw this on Twitter once you announced that we were going to respond to this video, someone's going to watch this video and think that they understand the fine-tuning argument. And all they've watched is this video. And they don't. They've got half the story, like 51% of the story, where that 1% is like three, a clip from Justin Brierley and one from William Lane Craig, and John Lennox gets one sentence. That's the worry I have. If you've watch Skydive Phil's video, but don't think that when you've done that, you understand the fine-tuning argument or the responses to it or the debate or that. You've got a slice of the debate. If you watch this, then you've got another slice. Go find some more.
Philip, what about you? What you got?
Yeah, just to repeat, really, that I do have very strong feelings, both positive and negative, about this video. There are a lot of stupid responses to the fine-tuning argument, and they're not in this video. There are great responses. There are great people. But but the whole way it's set up is very, very dishonest, and people who don't know the ins and outs of this will be deceived. There's no two ways about it. They will be deceived into thinking this is like climate change. All the experts agree, whereas there's just absolutely no consensus on this. And yeah, why are they so afraid about presenting both sides of the argument? If religious people did this, they'd get really annoyed. So would I. I get equally annoyed when the atheists do it. And the only other thing I've got to say is best of luck for your upcoming confirmation, Cameron. It's exciting developments.
Yeah, it's pretty big news in all sorts of Catholic circles. So I appreciate it. Yeah, well, Luke and Philip, it's been awesome. This has been a lot of fun, and we need to do some more work soon. Philip, I'm actually really glad and honored that you reached out and you were like, hey, let's do this. This video's coming out. And I think you emailed me before the video even aired, and you're like, let's do this immediately. And so we were like, I'm really happy that we were able to find a time to do this.
Yeah,
so
I was just
thanks for the idea.
Drinking, saw a tweet of the clip and thought, this is actually, it wasn't as bad as I thought. Some of the things like Barry Lower, you had Barry Lower in the trailer for it, Barry Lower saying, it's been refuted time after time. And I was a bit annoyed at Barry saying that, but actually, if you look in the proper context, he's sort of making a joke about the problem of evil as refuted. theism. It's not. He's not saying the fine tuning argument's
has
been
debunked
refuted, which would be. Yeah. No, it's been really good fun. Well, thanks for hosting it.
Yeah, no problem. And if you guys have any thoughts or ideas on future shows that you'd like to see with either Luke or Philip or both together again, then let me know in the comments. But other than that, thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is